On the recording. Okay, so I want to just really welcome everybody and just express my appreciation and a little bit of nervousness about presenting to this crowd that I care about so much. But I appreciate being given the space to share what has been a very important narrative in my life, and I hope a shared narrative as we go forward. Really, the essence of this is how to realize the promise of the Earth Regeneration Fund. And there will be 4 sessions, so this is the first one. And when I was talking with Joe about this series, he made the comment that the best strategy is to have a story that works. And I realized that that statement works on a number of levels. But in some sense, that is what I'm trying to do, is maybe lend some credence to the story of the Earth Regeneration Fund, build some confidence that in fact it is possible for this strategy to work in the world and for each of us. Another thing Joe said was that one measure of success for the Earth Regeneration Fund is that it becomes a story generating environment. And I really resonated with that because, well, it's already generating a lot of stories. But it really gets to this notion that we all have a story to tell if we can just create the conditions under which each of us is empowered to both tell and manifest our story. And that, again, is very much a shared goal of what I've been trying to do for some time, and a goal I have for this presentation as well. So I'm not coming with a sense of, I don't have the answers. What I have is a story that's animating me. And what I hope to do is connect my narrative with your narrative. And I can't do that without your help. So I'm going to take us part of the way there, and I'm going to leave it up to each of you to try and connect the dots to your story. And we'll have time to make those connections as we go through, but also session 3, the third session of this series, is going to be specifically about a more expanded space for us to make those connections. So if we're going to realize the promise of the Earth Regeneration Fund, let's take a peek at what is the promise of the Earth Regeneration Fund. So I listened to Joe's wonderful introduction, and to those of you that if you haven't seen it yet, I would strongly urge you to listen to the recording of that introduction to the Earth Regeneration Fund. I think it is here in the Regenerative Finance Lab. But I excerpted some statements from there to try and convey a sense of what this promise is. So one is that we're going to talk about a different way of relating to money that relates to a different type of economic system that needs to be created. So Joe, in his natural disarming way, has a tendency to blow by statements like this. But I want everybody to pause for a moment and say, okay, all right. First thing we knew, create a new economic system, right? So, all right, check. That's part of the promise, but it's not enough. At the core, we're talking about also reclaiming our sovereignty, right? Not really stepping into our power. This is really stepping into our power. So we need to reclaim our sovereignty, not just for ourselves, though. We need to build synergistic and collaborative story together. And what is this fund we're talking about? Oh, that sounds like a pile of money, doesn't it? Well, no. It's actually a collection of all the sources of value and the relationships between them. So it's both relationships among all sources of value within any context. And oh, by the way, money is only one source of value, right? So we need a new economic system. We need to reclaim our sovereignty. We need synergy and collaboration. We need to relate all sources of value. But actually, the Earth Regeneration Fund was envisioned by Joe in the book, The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth. So I pulled some excerpts from there, the framing of how did that book frame what the Earth Regeneration Fund is. And the first statement I jumped out at me is the land is the bank. Get your head around that for a minute. Each piece of land has natural capital. And the structure of the Earth Regeneration Fund is as a portfolio of land-based regenerative projects. And they fractally nest. And this, at the heart of all of this, is evolutionary coherence. We have to see how the functional relationships in our social niches, how those relate to the material flows of nutrients and energy across the landscapes we live. Take that in for a moment. This is the promise of the Earth Regeneration Fund, is manifesting that evolutionary coherence. And oh, by the way, we need to do all of this at global scale. This is a big ask. I think you would all agree. How do we even begin to get our heads around this, right? And so to do that, I'm going to place the Earth Regeneration Fund in a somewhat larger context. I'm going to zoom out and look at this larger story. And to do that, I'm going to take advantage of the work from my dear colleague who's joining us today, Roger Briggs, who wrote this book called Emerging World, The Evolution of Consciousness and the Future of Humanity. And that book and Roger gave rise to the Planet Project, which is that's the other major effort I'm involved in. I'll be talking more about my platform project, but since 2021, been along with Bo Resendez, our third founder, Roger and Bo and I co-founded the Planet Project. And so this is sort of a framing through that lens. So if we step back and look at the crises that we face, right? Climate change gets a lot of press. The polarization of wealth, the extreme polarization of wealth. The industrial ag model is leading to desertification. 10,000 years it took to develop topsoil since the last ice age. We've degraded 70% of that topsoil just in the last 50 years of industrial agriculture. We're experiencing a mass extinction event with huge biodiversity loss. Pollinator collapse, ecological collapse, food insecurity, climate refugees, an erosion of democracy, erosion of truth, political polarization. This is the cascade of crises. Now, how can we possibly move beyond our heartbreak if we start to recognize this? And even if we can embrace this emotionally, how can we begin to cognitively get our heads around solving for all of this? And if we try and attack them as point solutions, as many are, we don't see that as a path that can lead to success. We need to step back and say, what are the root causes behind this cascade of crises? And what Roger highlighted in his book is that the meta crisis really is rooted in a stage of culture and consciousness. And so in this book, he goes back through the history of humanity and identifies 4 major stages in the cultural evolution of humanity. We're in the middle right now of the 4th stage, which he termed material culture. And this was rooted in a lot of research that Roger did on others. And if you want to know more about that, I can put you in touch with Roger. He's right here. Or read his book, or join us on the Planet Project. But the point is that about 5,000 years ago, we shifted into this thing called material culture. And it is, in fact, the deep assumptions, the unexamined assumptions of this material culture that gives rise to all the crises we see today. And so if we're going to avoid civilizational collapse, it demands a profound shift in culture at global scale, a complete reimagining of who we are and how we interact as people and as participants in the web of life. And so the good news is that we are in the midst of this cultural shift. The evidence shows that there is emerging out of the very the collapse, the crisis that we face as a result of the memes of material culture. Those are creating the conditions for fundamental change. And in fact, fundamental change is happening. It's spontaneously emerging all around the globe. And if we can just accelerate that shift, it can give rise to an entirely different set of conditions. It can give rise to a flourishing Earth. And we refer to that as the Great Transition. And the goal of the Planet Project is to try and accelerate that great transition. So let's look at what are the essential mimetic shifts of the Great Transition. And in the Planet Project, we go into a lot more detail on different mimetic shifts, but we've distilled it down recently to 3 core shifts. So what are the 3 fundamental assumptions that give rise to material culture? The first is this meme of separation, this worldview that says the universe consists of separate material objects. People are separate from each other. People are separate from nature and from the sacred. We're just billiard balls bouncing around, subject to forces in a purposeless universe. The second fundamental meme of material culture is the meme of domination. And this has been explored at great depth by Riane Eisler. But it's this notion of domination and subservience hierarchy. I get ahead by dominating others, and if I can't dominate others, then I need to be subservient to them to earn their protection. It's all about power. It's about control. It's about competition. And the third major mimetic foundation of the material culture is exploitation. If we're going to win the game of domination, people and the natural world are seen as resources to be exploited in order to dominate. All of these memes reinforce each other. So these form what I refer to as a memeplex, in the same way that a geneplex is a collection of genes that replicates together better than they can replicate individually. These memes all support and reinforce one another. So they tend to replicate as a memeplex. In planetary culture, the meme of separation is being transcended into the direction of that recognizes the fundamental interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent nature of reality. It's the meme of interconnection, of oneness. And the meme of domination is giving way to the meme of partnership that's rooted in mutual respect, shared power, and collaboration. And the meme of exploitation is giving way to the meme of reverence, a sacred regard for the living universe and all that's in it. This is also a memeplex. Each of these memes mutually reinforces the other. This is what we mean by the mimetic shifts of the Great Transition. So how could this cultural evolution evolve? How might this great transition unfold? And to that, I'm going to look through a couple of lenses. One is the structural layers of cultural evolution that came from Marvin Harris in a book he wrote in 1979. And he basically said, structurally, we can think about culture at 3 layers. The foundational, the infrastructure layer is where the economic practices, where agriculture, transportation, energy, it's the technological and material foundations of our culture. At the structural layer, we have our social and our organizational systems. That's where education and justice, our decision-making, choice-making processes, otherwise known as governance. And at the superstructure layer, that's where worldview and ideologies and spirituality and values and beliefs and cultural narratives come in. That's where the arts and the spirituality and media tend to be placed in this model. Now, Harris was a Marxist, and so he tended to look, you can see from the title of his book, Cultural Materialism. If you're going to think about the causal connection between these layers, he tended to draw it this way. that in fact, our economic system, our agriculture system determines our structural systems and our worldviews. If you're coming more from a consciousness-centric perspective, then you will see the sort of the causality in the opposite direction. What we believe, what we think, that's what is manifested in our structure and infrastructure layers. Probably a more accurate representation to see them as co-arising and co-evolving. Our beliefs shape our structure and infrastructure, but our infrastructure reinforces our beliefs. So these layers are co-arising and co-evolving together. So one way to think about cultural evolution is in terms of these three layers. Another way to think about it is to use Bill Sharp's 3 horizons model, where horizon 1 is focused on activities that are happening in the present moment. It's like kind of what changes are possible right now within the current dominant systems and practices. Now, recognizing that these are going to have to be replaced if we're trying to achieve a fundamental shift. Horizon 1 changes are not enough, and anything we do here will need to be replaced or evolve. But it can be an important way of mitigating pain in the present and starting to change towards Horizon 2, which is really around the transitional innovations. That's where we see ideas and trends that really start to challenge some of the assumptions in Horizon 1 and start to imagine how things could be different. So there's experimentation here, viewed through the lens of Horizon 1. People operating in Horizon 2 can be seen as risky or unconventional. But finally, if we're going to accomplish fundamental shift, major transformation, we need to have people focused on building the future models. These are the transformative systems and the entirely new paradigms that give rise to our cultural manifestations. And so these are going to be seen as radical ideas. There are going to be radical innovations. And again, look through the lens of Horizon 1 and Horizon 2. They're going to seem like outliers or too futuristic, right? Unrealistic. That's crazy stuff, right? The important thing about this framing is that action is required in all 3 horizons at the same time. So it'd be a mistake to look at these in a linear fashion and say, okay, this year we do what we can in Horizon 1, next year we'll do Horizon 2, and then 5 years from now, we'll start working on building those future models. No, all 3 are required at the same time. We need people doing action, taking action in all 3 horizons all the time in order to help accelerate the great transition, this great cultural shift. And so if we're going to map this great transition from material culture to planetary culture, we can look at it through the lens of these 3 layers and these 3 horizons. And again, action is needed in all 3 horizons, and it's needed in all 3 layers. So if we start by thinking about Horizon 1 in the superstructure, what we see is messages that build environmental awareness, right? The messages of social activism. And that's starting to emerge, and that's starting to change minds a bit in Horizon 1. But Horizon 1 is still dominated by the progress through economic growth narrative, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, both parties cite economic growth as the key to sort of nation state health, right? So they're still caught in that material culture stage. Individualism, consumerism, and competition also continue to dominate as the memes that capture our mind share. In the structural layer, we begin to see regulatory frameworks that offer some environmental protections. We begin to see the introduction of corporate social responsibility programs, DEI initiatives, but again, still operating in material culture, still dominated by centralized power and decision-making, still focused on money and profit. And in the infrastructure layer, we see this explosion of NGOs that are, thank God, arising in response to all of the externalized pain that our current extractive, exploitative economic system is foisting on the world. So there's some really sacred work happening there, really heartfelt work, often at great personal sacrifice, people that are ministering to the pain. I was at an IONS conference in 2003. I think, I'm not sure they originated this phrase, but this is when it landed for me and I carried it with me, We need to hospice out the old, and we need to midwife in the new. So hospicing has to do with managing and mitigating and easing the suffering of an inevitable transition. It's not fighting against the reality of it. It's recognizing what needs to pass and easing the pain to the greatest extent possible. And that's really beautiful and sacred work. And that's how I tend to think of the work in NGOs. It's people that are really trying to mitigate the pain, trying to minister to those that are suffering. But we also need to midwife in the new, and that's going to carry us into the other horizons, right? In Horizon 1, in the infrastructure layer, we see the introduction of recycling, focus on energy efficiency starts to emerge, but we're still largely caught up in material extraction. We're still highly addicted to fossil fuels. We're still operating in the linear consumption, throwaway economic model. Organic farming is beginning to grow, but it's still within the context of the industrial ag model. And again, economic growth, mass production, and global trade are still the name of the game here. So if we move from Horizon 1 to Horizon 2, we begin to see shifts in the cultural narrative, right? This notion of maybe competition isn't all we need. Maybe collaboration would be good. This beginning to reemerge, reconnect with the nature of the interconnectedness of all reality, to maybe consider the possibility of our role as stewards instead of exploiters of the earth. And popular culture in movies and books and podcasts and films and so forth start to reflect these emerging values. We start to see experimental experiments conducted in institutional structures and practices. So we start to see some grassroots governance models, things like sociocracy, holacracies, cooperatives are starting to emerge, more models of participatory democracies. We get into global agreements on climate action. But these are all fragile and relatively fringe shifts towards cooperation and sustainability. In the infrastructure layer, we're seeing a growth in renewable energy, in composting, small local experiments in sustainable agriculture and sustainable circular economies. We see things like impact investing in B Corps and public benefit corporations emerging. Because these are still, though, largely rooted in the memes of material culture, and because it's simply the power of the current dynamics of the culture, a lot of these Horizon 2 innovations tend to get captured by Horizon 1 activities. They tend to get sucked into this, where you things like greenwashing or other forms of enclosure. So Horizon 2 isn't going to get us to the great transition. We need work in Horizon 3. We need to midwife in the new, right? We need to build those future models. At the superstructural layer, it means cultural and spiritual narratives that celebrate the interconnectedness of all life and see humanity as stewards, where our art and media reflect the beauty of our natural systems, emphasizing wholeness, balance, and interdependence. It's a remembering of indigenous wisdom, who never really embraced the memes of separation and exploitation and domination, right? So it's a rediscovery, and you see a lot of re-injection of indigenous thinking and a valuing of indigenous wisdom. More decentralized power and decision-making, bioregionally organized global cooperation, trusteeship models that instead of nation states focusing on corporate interest, we prioritize planetary health and social equity. Healthy networks of well-stewarded commons, regenerative ag, renewable energy, a polyculture instead of the monoculture of the global economic system. In Horizon 3, we see the emergence of a polyculture of regenerative closed-loop economies patterned after living systems. So I found this framing helpful, partially to deal with the overwhelm, right? So it was just like, whoa, way too much to think about everything that's involved in this great transition when I sort of try and take it all in at once. But segmenting in this way, I hope helps people figure out where they're drawn. I think people will be naturally drawn to different parts of this map, if you will, and recognize that because we needed action in all three horizon and all three layers, whatever sector in here that you're drawn to, that work is beautiful and needed. And so do it, do what you're called to. And so for me, when I wonder sometimes if I should be doing volunteering more in NGOs, um, it helps me to recognize, okay, no, that's actually not my calling. I have a calling, but it also increases my appreciation for the people that are doing that, as I mentioned earlier. So when I look at this map, I also help me understand like the focus of the projects I'm involved in. So I see the focus of the Planet Project as really trying to accelerate this shift in this cultural narrative, in the shift of consciousness. And whereas the design school, I think Joe has been very clear about not wasting time trying to convince people that the climate is, that civilization is collapsed. It's that notion of collapse awareness. It's like you can spend your time trying to open people's eyes, but we need some people focused on, okay, that's a given. Now, what are we going to do about it? And that's where I see the design school operating. I think of Bucky Fuller's famous quote about you don't change reality by fighting against it. You change reality by creating the new models that make the old model obsolete. That's what I see the design school is all about. That's what the Earth Regeneration Fund is about. That also is where my focus on the platform that I'll be introducing in session 2 is about. It's a platform for Horizon 3. And it looks radical and it looks futuristic and it looks unrealistic. And if it didn't, then it wouldn't be doing its job in Horizon 3. So that's where we're headed. So that's a lot I've covered. I've talked steady. Let me pause here and just see how this is landing for people and give people a chance to sort of weigh in. I'll also mention that I have a lot of material to get through in the first couple of sessions, but session 3 is going to be totally devoted to just having a conversation. So my apology for not allowing enough time in the first 2 sessions to really have a dialogue, but look forward to that in session 3. And Penny, I might ask at this point, has anything come through in the chat, or does anybody have any comments or observations they feel or questions to share at this point?
The only thing in the chat is from Claire, who is maybe Claire, you could speak it if you would like.
I would say you have an enthusiastic supporter.
Yeah.
Oh, I just want to say it's such a relief to hear others articulating things that like what you've pulled together is just it's just a relief to hear and to be here with others who I know are such good sense makers, that we're holding this together and moving forward together is amazing. So
yeah.
And Steve, I might just add a comment that I feel like what you're doing is like one of my favorite authors when I was a teenager was Stephen King, partly because he spends the first like third of the book developing characters. And then you're so caught up in the rich complexity of the characters that the stories are like amazing. And there's something about that ability to build up a context. And having explored a lot of these things, I'd say everything you're describing here is familiar to me because I've been swimming in similar waters. And then it's really important to set up just a clear context of it so that we can remember that we are definitely not being reductionistic. We're definitely not being partial. We're looking at truly transformational change. And truly transformational change is hard. And so, I used to have people tell me in the US, the typical reader has a 6th grade reading level. It's actually dropped to like 4th grade reading level now. But I'm like, but I'm not talking to everyone. I'm talking to people I'm talking to people who are doing what I'm doing, talking to my people. My audience is people that I'd want to do stuff with. And so it's really important to speak and think at the level of what we're dealing with. And what we're dealing with is we're dealing with transformation of cultural systems. So of course, and then systematizing it in the way you did does feel manageable. even though you and I both know that doing it in practice is really hard. And that's
Yeah, indeed. Shannon.
Yeah. Hi, Steve. Thank you so much. I loved your Three Horizons layout there. And before you said, look for your calling, I applauded myself right away. And I find that I struggle. I feel like I have a lot of skills that I can apply in a lot of places. And so sometimes I'm struggling where to put my energy, or I overcommit because I want to do it all. But when I had it all laid out there, I was like, bam, I know where I need to be. And like, I know it inside, but it was really cool to see it laid out that way. So thank you. That helped like give me a little clarity, but it's
That's
great.
awesome.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah. It served that purpose for me as well. So I'm so glad that you had that insight. Chris. Oh,
I just wanted to say very quickly that I love being in a place where I feel like I might be one of the least informed people in the room. Uh, I feel like you laid out so much there so beautifully that I feel like I've got, a reading list now for the next, quite some time of material to digest. And I just love where you're going with this. And to Joe's comment about, yeah, this stuff is hard. There's a lot of complexity here, but it's such a joy to be in this space where we're kind of jointly trying to figure out a way to describe this all. And yeah, anyway, so I'm just really excited by what you're laying out here, and yeah, just grateful for this presentation and what's to come.
yeah. Thank you, Chris. Well, we've got a long ways to go. So I'm going to pick up. That's basically the context, as Joe was.
Roger's got his hand up as well.
Oh,
But it's hard
It's
to
just
see.
it's in the corner and hard to see in his image. So
Yeah.
yeah, if Roger has something he'd like to share. Oh, and Roger, you're muted. So
Can't hear
yeah,
you.
if you can unmute yourself.
Thanks. Just very quickly, Steve, that was great. Of course, I'm familiar with a lot of that, but just seeing it laid out in that such a clear way. So brilliant, beautiful. We've
thank
got to
you.
grab some of that and record it and capture it.
Yeah, we will.
All right.
All right. So nobody wants civilizational collapse. And here I'm going to cite the work of Daniel Schmachtenberger. I assume most people are on this call are familiar with his work. I would highly recommend this two-part video on the third attractor, where he really paints this story in a compelling way, but that our current systems for coordinating collective action are caught in entangled webs of multipolar traps and perverse incentives. So we've got this global economic system that's extractive, exploitive, growth addicted, and polarizing. Our political systems are, the democracies are being co-opted by economic interests. I think we're all seeing the polarization. They're designed around 18th century information technology, where information was carried literally on horseback. And we see autocracies rising with a dystopian loss of personal freedoms. Social systems fragmented, educational systems just perpetuate the status quo, agricultural systems, and so forth. The meta crisis is a collective action failure. That's the point here. It's a failure of collective action. It's leading to a future that nobody wants, but we're systemically locked into this trajectory. And yes, there are bad actors, but the bad actors are also manifestations of the systemic nature of our culture that's rooted back in those foundations of separation and domination and exploitation. So there's a real call to action. Our economic system, our concept of money, our technology, our agriculture, our education, our governance, these are all rooted in, they are expressions of, and they serve to reinforce and sustain the memes of material culture. And our systems for collective sense making, for making meaning, and for making choices, those are all breaking down, right? We can't even agree on what is truth anymore. And so just at the time when we most need to be acting collectively for our joint benefit, these systems are breaking down. And we see asymmetric power and this technology that's exponentially progressing in both scope and pace. It's being wielded by those that are most invested in the material culture, that being the interconnected engines of global commerce. And so the call to action is to, again, to avoid civilizational collapse, demands a profound shift in culture at global scale, a reimagining of who we are and how we interact as participants in the web of life. Okay, but what can I do? So I get to this point. We all have gotten to this point to varying degrees, and I think we all face this question. But this question is rooted, the way I frame this, in terms of, oh, we need to avoid the bad shit, right? We need to avoid civilizational collapse. It's, in some respects, can be fear-based, right? So before I go on, I want to change the framing a little bit to point out that we can have a very different future. If we can enable and empower coherent and cooperative collective action, and if we can do that at all scales, going all the way up to commons and bioregions and planetary organisms, we could have a very different culture. And in fact, imagine the world we could have if our economic system, our concept of money, our technology, our agriculture, our education, our governance, what if all of those were rooted in, were expressions of, and serve to reinforce and sustain the memes of planetary culture? We just need to take that in. That's the positive attractor, right? It's not operating in fear of the collapse. It's operating in response, being pulled forward by the aspiration of the future we could have. And yet again, the question insists itself. Great, but what can I do? So this is the point I found myself. And to tell my story, though, you need to understand a little bit more of where I'm coming from when that question just pierced me. So I spent some time as an enterprise architect. So I'm going to talk, what is enterprise architecture? Most people don't know what enterprise architecture is, because enterprise architecture only arises in the context of very large businesses. And there's a set of frameworks and tools that allow those big businesses to start to get visibility and to start to be able to manage the full scope of a very large company. And so it has these different domains. One is the technology architecture. What is your tech stack for your organization? What kinds of information do we manage? And in what technology is this information managed? What's the application portfolio? What's the set of applications we use to run our business? And how are those creating and reading data? And how are those residing and running on our technology stack? And then finally, how is value distributed both within our organization and between our organization and the larger world? What are the business processes through which value can flow? And what information do those processes rely on and produce? What applications do they depend upon? What technology do they run on? How do all of those implement a security architecture, and how are they aligned with our strategy? How can our strategic goals be reflected in our data, our technology, our applications, and our business processes? So that's what enterprise architects do, is help bring that focus. Those of you that do bioregional mapping, you can kind of think of it as it's a mapping exercise, right? Map the information we move, the tech stack, the applications, the value streams, and so forth. So my story in this context is going to be framed in terms of the evolution of enterprise architecture. And I'm going to start with the framing that was done in 2006 by some people at Harvard, where they looked at the stages of maturity that organizations tend to move through. And so the first stage is business silos. And this is a product of the era of function automation. Many companies discovered that if they automated certain functions, they could greatly reduce the cost, they could reduce the errors, and it worked so well that they did it again. And then they automated the next function, and then the next function, and then the next function. And then when you do that a lot, And each time you're picking whatever technology was hot at the time in order to do that automation, you end up with this portfolio of business silos. And so, we used to call it islands of automation, islands of information. And so the next stage of enterprise architecture was to try and get a grip, because we have all these different technologies in our data centers and so forth, and the operational cost and just keeping up with the change and so forth was killing us. Not to mention its effect on preventing interoperability. So one of the first things that enterprise architects did as a budding discipline was to say, well, what if we take our focus out of the individual projects and let's focus on the organization as a whole, and how might we bring some standardization? Can we bring some rationalization to our technology portfolio? And then we realized that, well, we have all these apps and we have all this data, and the cost of trying to keep all that data synchronized and all those apps running and talking with one another, that's also a massive expense and cost and business agility and so forth. So if we could just rationalize these apps down into a smaller set and maybe collapse these databases into a smaller number of databases. Organizations that do that have entered into stage 3 of their enterprise architecture maturity. But then they find that we need more agility. And so that moves into stage 4 of business modularity. And then that's kind of where the book in 2006 left off. There were just beginning to be some enterprises move into stage 4. Since then, we've seen the emergence of cloud computing. So I put this in blue just to say this is my addition to it, but basically the emergence of cloud services. So that's been the evolution of an organization's enterprise architecture. But it turns out that's reflected in the evolution of the IT industry as a whole. So you can see that in the 80s, begin to shake out the foundational, it's kind of the emergence of the platform concept. So from literally hundreds of different operating systems that pretty much consolidated down into Mac OS, Linux, and Windows. And that shakeout was happening right in the 80s and 90s. And then to support this move towards app and data consolidation, you separate out those application-specific data management into shared databases. And this was the emergence of what's called relational database management systems. And that's where Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, made his first $1 billion, was Oracle dominating the relational database market. And then Oracle got in the game of application. The way he made his next $5 billion was to create these very large application suites, so that instead of leaving it up to customers to have to integrate all their different applications, you just buy this gigantic e-business suite and it's got everything covered for you. And SAP was the other major player in that space. And then as they were forced to move into business process management, and so you see new incarnations of their products in the form of Oracle Fusion and SAP NetWeaver. Salesforce emerged in the 2010s. As a cloud computing player. And then you have the 800-pound gorilla, which is Amazon Web Services, which has really brought cloud services to state of the art and dominant, really, in the market today. So that was the evolution of the IT industry. So my career tracked with this evolution. So in the 80s, I was the technical lead for distributed relational database development at Burroughs Advanced System Group. We had capabilities running in our product roughly a decade before Oracle came out with it. But we didn't have, for a variety of other reasons, that product failed, that initiative failed. I later became the VP of engineering for an object-oriented database company. In the 90s, I went to work for US West, which was a large telecommunications company. And that's where I first got into platform architecture and enterprise architecture. And so we articulated a strategy that we called the vertical to horizontal transformation, because it was a transformation from these vertical silos, these automated functions that had vertical silos. We did an inventory. There were 1,000 applications that US West used to run their business. And these were giant applications running on some of the biggest IBM mainframes available at the time. They'd been created by Bell Labs, a billing system for a telecommunications company that is the phone system across 14 Western states. That's going to be a big system, and the provisioning systems and activation systems, right? So these are big applications. They had 1,000 of them. They had customer information in more than 200 of these systems. And so we experienced this, the pain that I described in the evolution of organizations EA, and we launched this initiative to try and take us into a horizontal, what now would be called a service-oriented architecture. And to do that, we needed a platform. So after articulating the strategy, I led the platform architecture effort to create a distributed computing platform. There was about 40 of us on that team to create that platform. It's a pretty large effort. And eventually I became a development manager for a project that built an application on that platform to realize the strategy. And then I left Oracle to go to Sun Microsystems as the development manager for their online support center. This was just when the web was taking off, and they went from having all of their support calls, their customer support calls, coming via the phone to about 30% of them coming via the web while I was managing the rollout of their online support center. Later, I moved into software and enterprise architecture roles at Sun. And at the end, I led an effort called IBIS, which was a project to implement the Oracle e-business suite to replace. It turns out Sun also had 1,000 applications. When we did their application inventory, we found 1,000 applications they used to run their business. And we discovered that if we implemented all of the elements of all of the modules of the e-business suite that we could replace between 500 and 600 of those applications with a single instance of the Oracle e-business suite. And we were well along that path when Sun was bought by Oracle. So then I found myself working for Oracle. And there I did mostly technology architecture work, but I did lead their HIPAA compliance effort. It was a 3-year effort to get Oracle to the point where they could participate in customer agreements that required them being HIPAA compliant. And then later, for 3 years, I worked as an identity architect at a cybersecurity company called FireEye. So that was how my career tracked the industry. Now, I wanted to share this picture partly because of the deja vu I'm having. When I look at the regenerative movement, I see it positioned kind of in this business silos stage. Lots of different groups, but each with sort of these vertical siloed tech stacks and application suites and so forth. And I'll develop that point a lot more later, but that's just something I wanted to frame. But that whole story that I just told is really just part of my story. That's what I refer to as my economic self. But the other part of myself, my story, I characterize as my essential self. I was raised as a Christian Scientist. I had deep questions about how the universe worked and what my role in it was that led me to philosophy, and that was my undergraduate degree. I had a really profound experience of oneness over a space of a couple of days. I had this intuitive flood of knowing that everything was interconnected, and I could, and everything was conscious. And that progressed through a series of epiphanies over the years, many spiritual teachings and experiences, a lot of personal, meditation practices, Tai Chi, yoga, other practices, deep dives into how evolution worked, into sustainability, a deep dive into how evolution has overcome the barriers to cooperation. That was about a 18-month inquiry that I call Evo mimicry. And a growing concern about the direction our civilization and our planet were headed. And so, but I tended to compartmentalize these two parts of myself. So I didn't bring my essential self to my work, and I didn't bring my economic self to the communities and relationships where I was sort of playing out in my essential self. And I don't think I realized the extent to which this internal tension was fragmenting me. But in 2015, my wife and I were at a conference at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And that's the first time I heard the poet Drew Dellinger. He came on, I'd never heard of him before. He came on stage with little fanfare or anything, but just began reciting his poem, Hieroglyphic Stairway. And that poem opens with the lines, it's 3:23 in the morning, and I can't sleep. I can't sleep because my great, great, great grandchildren are talking to me in my dreams. They're asking me, what did you do when democracy was stolen? What did you do when the planet was plundered? Surely you did something. What did you do once you knew? I still can't recite that poem without feeling the emotional power of that question. It literally broke me open. It changed the course of my life because I knew in that instant that I couldn't plead ignorance. I couldn't say I didn't know. So what did I do? What will I do? What can I do? Within a year, I left Oracle, and I experienced what I characterize as a deep exhale, as the integration of these two selves, the tension I held. When it disappeared, it's like, oh, that's only when I became aware of how much tension I've been holding. And it felt so good that I knew I wanted everybody else to feel that too. So great, I left Oracle, but now what can I do? You just saw my background, in tech, working for Fortune 500 companies. So really don't see Fortune 500 companies on the forefront of this evolutionary shift we need. So what can I do? And in the course of a very creative period over the next, year probably, I formed Evolutionary Enterprises, and I was inspired with this vision of a platform that could be put in service to those on the forefront of the evolutionary shift that our living systems require. By this time, I'd become aware of many, many evolutionary thought leaders, many people doing brilliant reimagining of the world we could have. And so I had this vision of, well, what if we could have a platform that be in service to those people in the forefront of that? In 2016, I joined something called the Conscious Business Initiative, where I had the great privilege to meet and work with Penny. So our history goes way back. By 2018, I exhausted my own financial reserves and that of my family to the point where I needed to go back and refill the coffers. So that meant another stint in the corporate world. That's when I worked at FireEye. But since June of 2021, I've been 100% focused on the Planet Project and on bringing this platform that I call the MAP to production so they can be put in service to those on the evolutionary shift. So I want to tell a little bit more of the story of enterprise architecture, because not only did the stages of maturity evolve, but the actual definition of this term enterprise evolved. So it began as a large organization, and sort of the definition of an enterprise was and its technology assets. But as it matured into consider app and data, it said, oh, it's a large organization and its technology, data, and application assets. So it's still pretty much a technical focus. When it moved into business modularity, suddenly you needed to take your eyes, lift your gaze above just the technology and start looking at the people and processes and process flows, and start to interconnect outside your organization. And cloud services, the definition of enterprise didn't change, even though the foundations for it were changing. But the thing about all of those is they were all pretty much very large businesses, and those businesses had their mission, and your job as an enterprise architect was to help figure out how to make that business succeed with its mission. But then there was this phenomenon that happens here, that if you follow this trajectory, you see this growing asymmetric power. And the consolidation of apps, when Oracle dominates the database market, it becomes sort of the only game in town. And when it takes over along with SAP, creating these massive application suites, nobody could match their investment. So new players are essentially frozen out, and the switching costs for a customer are massive, right? Once you're locked into one of those, there's no getting out. And so there's this asymmetric power because the corporation that's offering this, the tech company, is enjoying a tremendous power advantage over the individuals or even the companies that are using them. And that translates to this huge polarization of wealth, right? So the 2023 or 2024, I can't remember when I took these numbers, Oracle had $10 billion in profit on $53 billion in revenue. Compare that to your regenerative project. Amazon, 2.2 trillion in market cap, over 600 billion of revenue, and 270 billion profit. Now, a lot of people know Amazon because of their e-commerce dominance, but actually the most profit at Amazon is generated by Amazon Web Services. 2/3 of that profit that they showed there came from their Amazon Web Services play, because so many people are now, and companies are relying on AWS services. So you get this huge power asymmetry. But now we enter this guy, Tom Graves, brilliant enterprise architect. I learned a lot from Tom. And he pointed out that actually organization and enterprise are not the same. That whereas an organization is a structure and a means to achieve an ends, an enterprise is really a shared purpose. It's a bold endeavor. Notice how that's liberated from the structural organization that's working towards that shared purpose. What binds that together is we're bound together by shared vision, values, and commitments. That's a reframing of the term enterprise. And it becomes realized in a network of interacting organizations. Tom also talked about how the metaphor of organization as machine is giving way to this notion that an enterprise actually is a social construct. It's bounded by human values and shared commitments. Hence, you can view it as a living entity in its own right. And this is echoed in the words of Barbara Marx Hubbard, who said the new structure we need is not some new organization, it is an organism. And another book I would recommend, Reinventing Organizations, from Frederic Laloux. He points out that life in all its evolutionary wisdom manages ecosystems of unfathomable beauty, ever evolving towards more wholeness, complexity, and consciousness. Change in nature happens everywhere all the time in a self-organizing urge that comes from every cell in every organism, with no need for central command and control to give orders or pull the levers. So we're reimagining this notion of enterprise as a bold endeavor realized by not organizations, but organisms. So what if we shifted our gaze from the large organization? What if we reframed or exapted the enterprise architecture to focus not on the large organization, not on businesses with missions, but in fact, missions with businesses? And this turn of phrase I owe to Michael Beckwith. Beautiful reframing, right? Instead of business's goal to realize their mission, what if we started with the mission that collectively we're trying to achieve? And maybe it's not businesses, maybe it's social organisms. So what might the architecture look like for the enterprise, whose bold endeavor was co-creating a world that works for all life, that has these sort of characteristics as a civilization? Doesn't that sound like the kind of enterprise you'd like to engage in? So imagine a new kind of enterprise. Instead of a very large business, it's a network of interacting organisms. And instead of coercive top-down push to get collective action organized, what if it was shared purpose allowed a bottom-up pull? an aspirational pull towards a shared goal that drew us together into alignment, into partnership at a bioregional level. What if we had a new kind of enterprise? What if we looked at bioregional funding ecosystems as a new kind of enterprise? What if we had open source and open-ended, decentralized, life-centric platform that empowered autonomous, sovereign people to self-organize in fractal hierarchies of cooperating groups, to conduct evolutionary experiments relying on a polyculture of decentralized governance models as we experiment with this new way of choice making that doesn't depend upon top-down coercive control, drawing on a network of well-stewarded information commons? What if bioregions as information hubs had agency? What if bioregions had agency and could organize into overlapping holarchies of bioregional agents at global scale? What if we could compost money from the extractive exploitative economy to jumpstart our regenerative economic flows with multidimensional expressions of both quantitative and qualitative value, and have multidimensional value flowing through service relationships rooted in trust, enabling integration collectively of our collective economic and essential selves, where the work we're doing that is the deepest calling of our heart also happens to be the work that's putting food on the table, that's putting roof overhead, that's enabling our families and loved ones to thrive and realize their highest creative expression. What if, in other words, we had a flourishing earth? That's the new kind of enterprise. How do we get to that enterprise? Well, in my framing, to do so requires a different mindset, a different architecture, and a different platform. So I'm going to start with the different mindset. So I frame this in terms of, think of a bioregion. And so the standard Silicon Valley response to things is to ask, what can this tech do to help, right? So we got a bunch of smart innovators, brilliant new ideas for what new technology we could have. And so it's like, how can we use this technology to help the bioregion? If you're a venture capitalist, or on Wall Street, you might say, we've got this pile of money. What can we do with this money? How can this money help the bioregion, right? And if you bring them together, it's got, well, we've got this Web3 technology, and we've got regenerative finance. How can regenerative finance help bioregions? And well, with the bioregional focus, we've got BioFi, right? So this is a problem-solving mindset, and it's really effective, and it's been used for a long time to foster some amazing innovation, to amazing change. But notice how it's still rooted in as Horizon 2. It's still rooted in sort of a finite games model. What if we turn this question around and say, approach this from an evolutionary mindset, not a problem solving, but sensing and responding and adapting? What if the question we asked is, what does this bioregion need? Not what can this tech do to help, not what can this money do to help, but what does this bioregion need? And to that, you need to sense into, what is the coherence of the bioregion? What is the health of the bioregion? Where is it falling short? Where are there deficits? Then, and only then, you might say, oh, a technological intervention might be needed here, or we need some money to support this need within the bioregion. But notice how that reorients the question. And notice how flows in a healthy regenerative living system don't actually depend upon external monetary or financial interventions, right? I mean, that's kind of the point of, regenerative agriculture, right? It's like, avoid the need for inputs of pesticides and inputs of fertilizers, right? And external irrigation, right? How can we create the conditions in which those external inputs are not required? That's a completely different framing. And the flows that make that happen, the mycelial networks, the soil health, the nutrient flows that are happening beneath the soil, and the transpiration and the larger ecosystem flows are largely invisible from the problem-solving mindset. Right? So the problem-solving mindset, you're sort of seeing, what can I do with the technology? What can I do with money? And from the evolutionary mindset, you're sensing into, what does this bioregion need? So that's really more of a Horizon 3 play. That's a Horizon 3 mindset. It's not in the realm of finite games, which, if you're familiar with James Carr's excellent Finite Games and Infinite Games book, it's not in the game theoretic win-lose Horizon 2 material culture kind of mindset. It's coming from the infinite game. How can we sustain the game? How can we just continue it indefinitely? And so it changes the perspective, the orientation we have towards technology and money to be in service to life instead of the other way around. And it tends to reinforce more of a pull than a push. Instead of pushing solutions in, it's like, what needs to be pulled in to our bioregion? And I think a really good metaphor for just internalizing this is, we don't push nutrients into the roots of a tree, right? We create a rich soil which has the diversity of resources it might need to draw on, and then it pulls in what it needs, base it on its own internal sense making about what it needs, right? So that's the sense in which we're trying to frame technology and money here, is like, yes, pull it in, and not just technology and money, but many other kinds of value, as we'll talk about, but don't push them into the bioregion. Let the bioregion sense into what it needs and pull it in. And it can only do that if it has sovereignty, right? So Joe talked a lot about reclaiming our sovereignty. The bioregion has to have the sovereignty to make these choices. And it needs coherence is sort of the goal, right? How can we bring this bioregion, all of these flows, into coherence? That's almost the definition of health. So this is the different mindset that I think this new kind of architecture requires. Moving from a problem-solving mindset to an evolutionary mindset of sense and respond and adapt. Also think we need a different architecture. And so to make that point, I'm going to talk about how the current prevailing systems architecture, again, it's rooted in, it's an expression of, and it serves to reinforce and sustain the memes of material culture. We saw how that progression of the IT industry consolidated power, disempowers individuals, that devalues life. So how can we invert that power asymmetry? Now, living systems are not designed top-down, they self-organize bottom-up, and yet our existential risks are global in scope. So the scope of our enterprise, this bold endeavor, must also be global. So how can we bridge this gap between self-organizing, hyper-local change and bridge it up to global scale? How can we foster cooperation at global scale while avoiding the dystopic outcomes that happen when you consolidate power, and at the same time avoiding the catastrophic outcomes that arise from this extractive, exploitative, unsustainable economic system? So is that even possible? So I saw these as three important challenges. If we're going to realize this goal of regenerating Earth, somehow we need to address these three challenges. And so to see this sort of architectural shift, I want to talk about a new way of thinking about information systems architecture that is person-centric. And to do that, I inserted this picture because these beautiful creatures are my three grandchildren, and they inspire me in my work and reinforce what I already know, which is this is vital, important work that the world needs, but it personalizes it to they need it. So I do the work for these smiling faces. So what is this current architecture that predominates? Paradoxically, it puts the apps that are giving us more and more power, that are proliferating, it delivers that power via profoundly and progressively disempowering architecture. So there's that phrase, there's an app for that, right? And so much of the dialogue goes around, what's your app do? What app do we need here? It's all about the apps. Not enough attention is spent to the architecture through which the functionality of these applications is delivered. Well, let's start with the notion that people are complex and multidimensional. So I'm a complex multidimensional being, so are you. And I have a genetic signature, but I also have a mimetic signature, which are the values I hold, the aspirations I have, my assumptions about how the world works. Even parts of my knowledge are part of my mimetic signature. So here I am, this complex, multidimensional human being. How well do our predominant information systems support me? Well, let's take a look using Facebook as an example. This applies to almost any app you can name. It's going to start with, I have to establish my identity with my app, right? So if you're going to use any app on the internet, you need an account. You need to establish your login, right? Sign up, then sign in. Establish your identity. And you need to do that because in many cases, the app is storing information about you, right? So in some sense, it's a good thing because I don't want to maybe give that information to everybody. So yeah, the fact that I have to prove my identity to this app kind of makes sense so that I can access the data they store about me in their application. And the user interface that I use is determined by the application, right? The look and feel is set by Facebook in this case. And it tends to reduce me to this utilitarian role, not of being a complex multidimensional being, but to being a user. I'm the user of the system. That's how I'm narrowly defined, right? So I love this quote from Tufte: only drug dealers and software companies call their customers users. Yeah, verily. Okay, so then each app also pushes its notifications to me based on what it thinks it's important, when it thinks it's important for me to know about this event. And so that's kind of the classic application-centric architecture. But of course, I use more than one application. So what if I extend this out to 8 applications? And now I see that my online self is being fragmented across each of these applications, right? My data, my social data is fragmented in Facebook, and my financial data in Wells Fargo, and my health data in UC Health, and my career in LinkedIn, and my genetic history in 23andMe, and so forth, right? So I've got data fragmented across all these different applications. My identity is fragmented because I have a different identity in all of these. The user experience is fragmented. Each app has its own user interface, and I'm getting notifications coming at me from all these different apps. So the burden of bringing coherence to all these different fragments of my online self, that burden falls on me. And I ain't getting help from the app providers because, in fact, especially those that subscribe to the attention economy business model, they're actually applying all of their sophisticated AI and neuroscientists, cognitive scientists to capture my attention, really to activate my limbic system and to keep me distracted from my task and purpose so I can stay captured in their application so they can push more ads into my opened mind, my captive mind, right? So good luck getting help from them in building this coherence. And then furthermore, I'm data disempowered, right? Because I don't really have visibility or control over how my data gets shared. And so I have this sense that apps and their providers are in charge of all these little bits of me. But of course, I use more than 8 applications. And as I add more apps, this proliferation of apps, it just increases the fragmentation. It decreases the coherence and empowerment. And so if you multiply that by tens and hundreds, here's another example that I think strikes close to home. This I guess, I don't know Elijah Manor, but someone shared this tweet with me. I'm sure you can kind of relate. I keep having a hard time keeping track of which contacts use which chat systems, right? How many of you have experienced this kind of technological heterogeneity, as we would say? So is there an alternative? What if I determined what was urgent to me? What if there was a layer that intercepted all of these notifications and I had control over what, where, and in what form, and whether I received these notifications? I could choose to receive them as a text if I wanted. I could say, don't notify me at all. I'll go to the notification center when I'm ready to do so, and I'll see what notifications are there. What if I was empowered to shape my own human experience? What if instead of the user interface being dictated by the application, I could build a coherent human experience of all this application functionality? What if instead of me proving my identity to applications, what if apps established their identity with me? What if instead of the app storing my data, I stored my data on my devices? And therefore, I have visibility and control over who sees my data. And finally, what if I bring the apps to the data? Instead of bringing myself to the app and having the app, I give my data to the app. What if the app came to the data? I mentioned when I was at Oracle, I led their HIPAA compliance effort. And the big mantra, that was a 3-year effort. It turns out they're not a healthcare company, but their support organization supports customers that are in the healthcare business. And so when they had a problem, the customer had a problem, they would say, well, download your database or download your log files or whatever. And so there could be personal health information in those files. And so these customers said, well, if we're going to do that, you need to prove that you can protect it in a way that's HIPAA compliant. And Oracle couldn't. So they were walking away. They estimated, I think, $20 million of revenue a month, lost opportunity because they couldn't enter those deals that required HIPAA compliance. How did we get there? We found that every engineer had their own favorite scripts, their tool, and they would copy the data that the customer uploaded to their tool and then run their script on it and diagnose what was going on with the customer situation. But as soon as you copy that data, you lose control. So we inverted that model, and instead of bringing the data to the apps, to the tools, right, we brought the tools to the data. We managed the data centrally and brought the apps into that ecosystem. That's the same principle here, except now it's my data and I bring the apps to me. That's what person-centric architecture is about. And notice now how this has expanded my membrane of personal coherence and empowerment. So that's the kind of architecture that I think is needed for this new kind of enterprise, instead of application and provider-centric, person and agent-centric. But we also need a new platform. So if we reimagine this enterprise, and I invite you to do this for yourself. Think about your project in your group or your community, and just think about, what is your tech stack? What kinds of information are you tracking in your data architecture? How and where is that information stored? What applications do you use? How is value flow managed? What processes do you have? How well do these support your strategies? And now think about not just your project, but think about answers to the question across the entire landscape of regenerative projects that are happening all around the globe. Can you feel into sort of the heterogeneity? Can you see those silos? Can you see the barriers to cooperation, to interoperability, to sharing? What if we had a platform that could foster communication, could foster integration, could foster sharing, and which offloaded the job of managing all that tech from each project? What if we could leverage an architecture and a platform that was comparable in power and sophistication and reach to those enjoyed by Fortune 500 companies, but created by and for those on the forefront of our evolutionary transformation, right? So what might that platform look like? What characteristics would it need to have? How could it be realized? Is it even possible? Is there a path to meaningful adoption of such a platform? Those are the questions that have been occupying space in my mind for close to a decade. And that's going to be the focus of the next session. So again, apologies for just droning on for such a extended period of time, but we do have a few minutes left. I would just love it if some other people could weigh in and just share reactions, comments, questions.
I mean, I'd like to just invite us all to take a moment and feel the journey that Steve has been on. Just feel what it's like for someone to be working in a space that's so complex and dynamic that they're able to learn how to do this kind of architecture work over the span of decades. And then to be able to sit with questions with such clarity as a designer. As a designer, these are the questions I answer in my job. So I actually know how to answer them. So even if you might be sitting here going like, I have no frickin' clue how to answer those questions, Steve has been asking these questions for almost 10 years, after something like 30 years of answering these questions in his daily work. And this may be similar to the experience for those of you who attended Chris's talks about, data supported inquiry. You're like, how the hell could anyone do that? Like, well, first he spent 10 years at a university, and then after that. And so just recognizing to give that space, because we're coming together now in service to answering these questions. And I think as you're going to see in the next session, there's no way to answer those questions in Steve's head. They have to be answered in practice through experimentation and collaboration with architectural design. And so I want to name that to remind us why we're having this session. It's not just to be blown away by the brilliance of Steve and his questions. It's that this needs to be built. And so with that, we've got a nice lineup with Claire, Bill, and Chris. So maybe pass it over to Claire.
Oh, you're on mute, Claire.
Yeah, just a huge thank you, first off. That's amazing. And just how incredibly valuable it is to have someone who does, as Joe was saying, just deeply knows the space that you've been in, and then to sort of help demystify some of the things that other people may have thought of in bits and pieces, but that you're able to put together. Just deeply appreciating, holding those questions all the way through, but the power of that, and demystifying the inside, because unless you've got people who have been working with those systems, anyway, just we're richer for it when people who've been working with them can share. And because I do think there are patterns, and I loved how you were drawing on that. So.
Yeah, you want to, and let Steve, were you going to respond to that?
I just to respond with appreciation, and I guess I'd also respond to what Joe was saying, is that I'm bringing this narrative to this community, trying to connect with your narratives, and I can only go part way. So I'm just coming from my framing, right? From my perspective, from my background. And if we can collectively connect our narratives, that's where the power emerges. That's where the solutions will emerge for us, right? So this is just the start of that dialogue. And so I appreciate the insight that Claire shared, and I take it as an opening to that dialogue with Claire, who I've already been privileged to enjoy. We've been doing a deep dive here the past several days, Chris and Claire and I. So I already have part of that, but yeah. So thank you for that.
Great. I just wanted to put out, I know that this is part of an ongoing series. So this is really, I guess, a provocation or question for maybe the next round, where I mean, first off, deep appreciation for what you've just presented. It is the depth of it is going to resonate until at least the next time, and obviously beyond. You talked about collapse awareness, and then you talked about, if we are to avoid civilizational collapse. And I guess the question that I wanted to raise is the question of, what if we can't avoid that, and rather we are navigating that collapse instead of just avoiding it? And I think that framing it slightly differently like that is significant. And so I just wanted to plant that seed of, a next conversation where we both think about, obviously, if we can avoid the worst, that would be great. And how do we prepare ourselves along the multiple lines that you mentioned for the potential of not necessarily avoiding that, but being present with it? So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and thanks for that. And I agree with you that a slight reframing would matter a lot, because we're not going to avoid the collapse. We are in the collapse, right? And so we need to navigate our way through it. I think what I was trying to say with that is, can we avoid enough of it before everything completely falls apart and we have no capacity to respond, to get the new systems in place and get the new civilization built? But it's not like we can, stave off the collapse. It's collapsing of its own weight. That's why we need to hospice it out, not argue against the inevitability of its demise, but mitigate the pain and suffering as it goes out while we're building the new. And hopefully we get the new structures in place before we've collapsed to the point where, global coherent action is simply not possible anymore. So yeah, thank you for that. That's a great observation. Chris.
There's so much here, as you can imagine, that I resonate with. I was thinking to myself, where were you in 2016 when I needed to find you? Because I gave a talk in 2016 entitled Digital Vulnerability, and it was kind of at the peak of, well, actually, I shouldn't say the peak. It was the beginning of discussions around like privacy preserving, machine learning, and kind of just really trying to get into these kind of deeper data privacy issues. And I was making a pitch at the time, albeit unsuccessfully, to say, look, we're in this mode where we think we have just kind of a binary choice, where it's like we accept the current model where, startups and other corporations basically have all of our data. And then as they accumulate more and more of it, they can make inferences about all sorts of things that can go way outside of their business model. Or we go to the alternative, we don't give them anything. That there was an interesting middle ground in there to explore in terms of essentially kind of having limited disclosure in a certain way, not necessarily of raw data itself, but then allowing for kind of collective inference to happen, but meanwhile preserving privacy of your data. And so that inherently meant a decentralized architecture of some sort, and then interesting kind of innovative algorithmic innovations there to create the kind of the collective value. So anyway, I just wanted to say very quickly, like I'm really looking forward to hearing how you lay this all out, because you're in a place where you can go in a much deeper, into much more depth on all of these dimensions than I could at the time. That just really wasn't my background, but I was trying to kind of make a case that there's an opportunity here. But everybody looked at me like I had 10 heads, like, what? What are you talking about? And of course, it wasn't going to align with like the venture model and, so many things about how Silicon Valley ran. So anyway, just deep respect for what you're putting together here. And also just such a joy to hear you tell your kind of whole story and talk about kind of integrating your work life and just the rest of you. And that just speaks to me on such a deep level, obviously, as a fellow technologist. So for sharing all that.
Well, thank you, Chris. And, as you know, I have deep appreciation and respect for your work, and I look forward to the fruits of our collaboration here as they unfold, as I do with everyone in the design school who, we each have our own stories. And just imagine if we can unlock, if we can remove those barriers to each person's highest creative expression, what a world that could be, right? Ain't going to be easy, but I can't think of anything more important to work on. So.
Yeah, Steve, I wonder if it'd be okay for me to just offer a little context about the series as I see it. Because, one of the things I'm like privy to, one of the things I'm holding is the emerging process of how we weave stories for these bioregional funding ecosystems and how we move money and relationships into the land-based projects and community projects in Barichara, et cetera. Like I'm in a flow of real world action where the kinds of things we're talking about are needed and they need to be designed from these places of real world action. And so just as a little example, Penny and I were on a call with Brandon and Claire just before this session, and we talked about how to build a bioregional mapping capacity that could be replicated across different bioregions. So people, when they're getting started, could learn how to go from starting to map their bioregion to moving financial flows and doing governance and setting up their learning ecosystems and the other things that we all know that the bioregions need to do. These are not just abstract exercises. They're exercises grounded in cultivating the capacity to create real world change. And so what I see happening here with this 4-part series and just how beautiful it is that this is happening after Chris just led 2 sessions, and next week Bill's leading a session on bioregional carrying capacities. And you can start to feel some energetic shift in the design school of different kinds of really advanced thinking coming together where some kind of collective actions become possible. We don't quite know what they are yet. We don't quite know how they could be coordinated, and we'll probably mess them up a little bit. We'll stumble and learn. But the idea of this series is that Steve felt the clarity that the way that we're helping to create decentralized and parallel collaborative frameworks for different bioregions, as we did in our learning journey earlier this year, and now we're helping to set up financial flows into parallel bioregions, is a space in which the kind of platform he's talking about can be prototyped. It can be prototyped in real world applications. And so where applications here is not computer apps or phone apps, the applications like, did you create a governing group for that watershed? Like applying it to the world and applying it with the world, not as something apart from it. So the thing I wanted to say is that the timing of this is emergent, and it is exactly the pull attractor that Steve was describing. That attractor pulled Steve and his work into the conversation about the Earth Regeneration Fund. And so that's where the timing and the flow of this is. And Steve felt very clearly he wanted to do this series before we go quiet for our 2 weeks at the end of December. That's why he's doing them as 4 weekly segments. But that means we'll start the new year with this ground laid and with these sessions recorded and with a sense of what we might do with it. So I just wanted to give that bit of context to say that this is not happening in a vacuum. This is the anti-university model. It's not academic knowledge that's then put into a paper that only other academics can read. It's the other way around. It's bring this advanced technical knowledge to the world of practitioners to support what we're all trying to do in our communities and just how different that is. So that's what I wanted to name. And I don't know, Penny, if there's anything you want to say before we close.
That was good.
Okay. But I just wanted to name that from the lens of not just the design school, the lens of this work that's being done, this work of parallel organizing in bioregions, and how important it is for these kinds of coordinating mechanisms that Steve is talking about, for them to be created. So that's what I wanted to say. And then Steve, if there's any way you'd like to bring us to a close.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that framing. It does feel like we're collectively moving towards a story that works. right? I think we're adding texture and color and depth and yeah, and if we can figure this weave out, I just remain hugely excited about the potential for us together and the reality we can manifest. I want to thank everybody for joining today. We'll get into more depth about the platform that I've been working on for a decade next time. Then we'll really have a time for weaving together, what's alive in you and how might that connect to the story. And we'll close in session 4 with, okay, great, what can we do now? What are pragmatic steps we can start taking today? Because spoiler alert, the platform I'm working on is not ready to be used. So I had some trepidation about even bringing the story. I don't like to talk about the platform. I used to, but then I realized the more I talk about it, the less time I spent building it. And when I talked about it, people either, like Chris said, had no clue what I was talking about, or they said, oh, that sounds great. I don't think you can do it. Seems too hard. Or they said, that sounds great. I think you can do it. When can I use it? And I realized that my only response to all 3 was to build the thing. If you don't understand what I'm saying, well, that's okay. You don't actually need to understand how the engine works in order to be able to use it, right? And if you think it's great, but you don't think I can build it, you could be right? But if I build it, that's how I respond to that criticism. And if you want to use it, I need to build it. So it's like all 3, the answer to that is build it. So that's mostly what I've been focusing on, but I did feel called and was supported by Joe and Penny saying, no, you tell the story now, it's okay. So that's why I'm here. But I do want to leave you in session 4 with, there is a pragmatic path that I'm pretty excited about that can lead to, it's an on-ramp into the adoption of the platform we'll be talking about. So that's what's coming up.
Yeah, and I just want to name that part of the art of manifesting is to invite a story into being that is so seductive, everyone has to build it. And so, and if you want to see an example of that, look at me talk about my daughter and restoring dead rivers. And it was like, I want to be a part of that. And then we raise money. And so, and people come and do it. And so there's the seductress. This is super important, and it is a sacred feminine energy. The seductress is the attraction to birth what is too beautiful to ignore. And it's really, really important, and it's a great power. As many of you women know, it's a great power to be seductive. And I don't just mean in the sexual sense, I mean in the deep creative sense. And so in the deep creative sense, we need a story that's so attractive that draws us in, and we need to build it. And instead of being like, oh, Steve, that swindler, he lied about it, it never happened, is that we actually are seduced by the universe into building it. Helping it happen. And so there's a deeper level of this that's very, very real. And that's what I hope is going to occur.
And I feel that both Chris and Steve, they open up the possibility to dream in ways that we've closed down in ourselves. Like that Steve kept asking, well, what if this, and what if this, and what if this? What if this could actually happen? That's the seduction, right? It's the we can actually dream this and we can build it.
Yeah. Steve, thank you for inviting us into a very juicy story.
Thanks for going on the journey with me. I look forward to the next session. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you all soon. We'll also get this recording up very quickly.
Awesome.